from a group of ununified warring tribes to arguably the most important country in Europe. Germany, and the Germans which call it home, have certainly seen a lot throughout their long history. But where did these people come from, and how did they eventually go on to, despite many challenges and setbacks, become one of Europe's most powerful and influential countries? Those are of course the questions I'm going to be answering in today's video with the history of the Germans. Just a disclaimer before I start, I understand that there are pretty big differences culturally, linguistically, and even to a slight degree ethnically between the many subgroups that inhabit Germany, and groups like Bavarians or Swabians could very well have had their own videos. However, for simplicity's sake, I've decided to just make it a single overarching video covering all the subsets that are generally considered to make up the larger German ethnic or national group. One more thing before we start, I am actually learning German at the moment, so if I mess up any pronunciation in this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if any actual Germans could correct me in the comments, or Austrians or Swiss for that matter. With that out of the way though, and without further ado, let's get straight into the video. The oldest traces we have of modern humans in Germany were found in the cave Ilsenhöhle, in the modern state of Thuringia, where human remains dating up to 47,500 years old were discovered, with these actually being among the oldest in Europe. Additionally, the 41,000-year-old Lowenmensch, or Lion Man, figurine was also found in Germany, and represents the oldest certain figurative work of art in the whole world, and has been attributed to the Aurignacian culture, a subset of the larger Cro-Magnon group. The hunter-gatherers responsible for these works remained in Germany throughout the next few tens of thousands of years until the first groups of early farmers began to migrate into Europe from Western Anatolia at the beginning of the Neolithic period, between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. By about 5500 BC, central Germany had well and truly adopted this new, more sedentary way of life, and had become one of the primary areas of the linear pottery culture. Throughout the next few thousand years, Germany, like most other parts of Europe during this time, saw many new cultures come, go, and merge with each other. One significant long-lasting change occurred when, following the Indo-European migrations into Europe around 4,500 years ago, the corded ware culture emerged and spread across much of Central Europe, including practically all of what is now Germany around 2900 BC. Shortly following the end of this corded ware culture, the Unitis culture, I'm probably butchering that, is generally credited with bringing the Bronze Age to Central Europe, including much of Germany in around 2300 BC. By the late Bronze Age, this culture had been succeeded by the Urnfield culture in most of Central Europe, including the southern and central parts of Germany, whereas further north the Nordic Bronze Age had developed and maintained a hold in of course Scandinavia, as well as the northern parts of modern-day Germany. Interestingly, the Italic peoples, including the Latins, from which the Romans emerged, are themselves believed to have come from the Urnfield culture of Central Europe. In the majority of Germany, however, these people were instead succeeded by the Hallstatt culture, leading up to and during the early Iron Age. The latter part of this Hallstatt culture, and the Latena culture which followed it, are generally considered to be Celtic ones, distinct from both the Italic peoples to the south and the Germanic peoples to the north. The genetic and cultural origin of these once Celtic parts of modern-day Germany would be changed forever though when, beginning around 700 BC, or maybe a little later, the Germanic peoples from southern Scandinavia and northern Germany began expanding south and gradually replaced the pre-existing Celtic people in Central Europe. In saying that though, it must be said that much of what exactly happened during this period is clouded in mystery and uncertainty, and the exact formation and spread of the Germanic tribes that would eventually call modern-day Germany home is hotly debated. Regardless of how and exactly when they arrived, these Germanic tribes would first encounter the Romans in the mid-1st century BC, when Julius Caesar constructed the first known bridges across the Rhine during his campaign in Gaul, and led an army into the territories of the local Germanic tribes. Though after several days and having made no contact with the Germanic tribesmen, who had retreated inland, Caesar returned to the west of the river. By 60 BC, a Germanic tribe known as the Suebi, under chieftain Ariovistus, are believed to have conquered the lands of the Gallic Aedui tribe to the west of the Rhine, with their subsequent plans to repopulate the region with Germanic settlers from the east being vehemently opposed by Caesar, who had already launched his own campaign to subjugate all of Gaul. The Germanic tribe don't appear to have given in so easily though, and they met the Romans in battle in 58 BC in the Battle of Vosges, where the Romans emerged victorious, forcing the Suebi to retreat back across the Rhine and abandon their plans. Sometime later, after the establishment of the Roman Empire, Augustus began to consider further conquest beyond the Rhine and the Danube, not only due to their normal foreign policy, but also necessity to put an end to the countless Germanic incursions into the still rebellious province of Gaul. As a result, in the following years, the Romans made made many incursions into the Germanic lands, which were almost always characterized by frequent massacres of villages and indiscriminate pillaging. This continued until a combined Germanic force under the leadership of Cherusci chieftain Arminius, who had actually been taken as a child and raised in Rome during one of those aforementioned incursions against his tribe, inflicted a devastating defeat on the Romans at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. I actually already have a video on Teutoburg, so if you want to know more about what happened there, you should definitely check that out. Their defeat at Teutoburg ultimately forced/persuaded the Romans that further conquests into what they referred to as Germania were not worth the effort and high casualties they would cause. Consequently, Rome decided to permanently establish the Rhine/Danube border, which remained throughout the rest of the Roman-dominated era. In saying that though, several Germanic tribes still lived under Roman rule in some of the areas south and west of this border, with Christianity actually first being introduced into these areas, known as West Germania, a few hundred years later, as evidenced by Christian religious structures in the area, built during the reign of Constantine I from 306 to 337. While these West Germanic tribes were exploring their new religion, their neighbours to the east were far from idle. Unfortunately for Rome, their 3rd century crisis, a period in which the empire nearly collapsed under the combined pressure of foreign invasions as well as domestic issues, perfectly coincided with the emergence of a number of large West Germanic tribes, some of whom, combined with other already well-established tribes, potentially sensing Roman weakness, began crossing the border with the Romans, with the most notable of these tribes being the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Burgundians, Lombards, Saxons, and Franks, who all played their part in the eventual downfall of the Roman Empire. A few years before the Visigoths would go on to sack Rome, in the early 5th century several other tribes, including the aforementioned Vandals, went on to permanently settle across the Rhine within the by this point crumbling Western Roman Empire. Following the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, the Franks soon emerged as a tribal confederacy in the middle Rhine-Weser region, forming a state which would soon be called Austrasia, or the Eastern Land, which comprised parts of present-day Belgium, Luxembourg, France, the Netherlands, and of course, Germany. To the south, the Alemanni also established their own kingdom known as Swabia, with a few further Germanic kingdoms popping up as well, such as Saxony, Thuringia, and Bavaria. Over the next few years, the Merovingian kings of the Franks gradually conquered many of these kingdoms as well as some of their smaller neighbours, and by the rule of King Clothar I from 588 to 561, ruled a large part of what is now Germany, excluding the southeast, which remained under the control of the Ostrogoths, and the north from the seaboard to the Harz Mountains, which was still controlled by the Saxons who had remained in their homeland and not migrated to England. Throughout the next century and a half or so, the Franks continued to expand their influence and control, further annexing Swabia, Burgundy, and western Switzerland during this period, with them also beginning to apply pressure to the Lombards of northern and central Italy. An important development occurred in the Frankish Empire when a dynastic change took place following the deposition of the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, in 751 by Pepin the Short, signifying the beginnings of the Carolingian dynasty. While I'm sure most of you haven't heard of Pepin the Short prior to now, I guarantee the majority of you have heard of his son, being none other than Charlemagne himself, who succeeded his father following his death in 768. Following his ascension to the throne, Charlemagne quickly went about conquering and expanding the already large Frankish Empire even further. The first of what would prove to be many victims of Charlemagne's ambitions would be the Saxons of northern Germany, against whom Charlemagne launched what became known as the Saxon Wars in 772, while elsewhere he ended the 200-year-old Lombard dynasty in Italy, crowning himself king in their stead in 774. Following the defeat of the Lombards, Charlemagne began focusing further on the north and the east, eventually subjugating the Saxons after 30 years of conflict in 804, brutally and forcibly converting them to Christianity in the aftermath, before further conquering the Bavarians and other non-Germanic groups such as the Pannonian Avars and some Slavic groups during this period. By the end of Charlemagne's reign in 814, the Frankish Empire had conquered large swathes of Europe, including practically all the Germanic tribes of the time and the majority of what would become modern Germany. The good times, at least for the Franks, less so for the people they were conquering, would not last forever though, and following the death of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious in 840, infighting broke out between the grandsons of Charlemagne, which ultimately resulted in the kingdom being split into 3 parts by the 843 Treaty of Verdun. Crucially for our story, the second son of Louis the Pious, who would become known as Louis the German, received the eastern portion of the kingdom, which soon adopted the name of East Francia, and controlled all lands east of the Rhine River and to the north of Italy, encompassing the territories of the German stem duchies, Franks, Saxons, Swabians, and Bavarians, giving the new kingdom dominion over most of what would become modern-day Germany. This union of German territories would not last long under Louis the German, however, as before long, acting in a way not dissimilar to how their father had, his sons revolted, and he was eventually forced to grant each of them rule over parts of the kingdom, with his eldest son, Carloman, being granted the Kingdom of Bavaria in 864, which was followed by him dividing the remaining of his lands the following year between his other two sons, with his middle son, Louis the Younger, being granted Saxony with Franconia and Thuringia, and his youngest son, known as Charles the Fat, being granted Swabia, as well as what was at the time known as Raetia, which encompassed modern-day eastern and central Switzerland. After a bit of carnage, to put it simply, and complicated politics, most of these areas were eventually reunited under the first non-Frankish king known as Henry the Fowler, who ruled from 919 to 936 and was followed by his son Otto I, who was crowned German king at Aachen. In the following years, the new king, who would become known as Otto the Great, went about further consolidating his power on his lands internally, as well as protecting them from external threats. Notably, he decisively defeated the Hungarian Magyars, who had been raiding into the area for some time at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, before also subjugating the Slavs along his kingdom's border between the Elbe and Oder rivers, largely in modern-day eastern Germany in the areas and states surrounding Berlin. Otto also marched on Rome and exerted great control over papal affairs, which in 962 resulted in him being crowned emperor by John XII in Rome, officially reforming what would become known as the Holy Roman Empire, which had technically existed under Charlemagne but lapsed in the intermittent years. Otto's successors continued to rule the empire for the next few generations until his grandson Otto III died childless, with the throne then passing on to his second cousin Henry II, who likewise died childless, finally resulting in the end of the Ottonian line and the beginning of the Salian dynasty when Conrad II, who himself was actually still a great-great-grandson of Otto I, took the throne in 1027. A bit later on, in 1096, the First Crusade broke out, in which many German knights and pilgrims made their way to fight for the Holy Land, with the noteworthy Teutonic Order emerging from their efforts in around the year 1190. A significant change would occur for Germany when a process known as Ostsiedlung also began around this time in the mid-12th century, in which many ethnic Germans slowly began migrating eastward, primarily to what is now modern-day Eastern Germany, as outlined previously, but also to areas in Austria, Poland, and the Czech Republic, areas which had previously been inhabited by various Slavic, Baltic, and Uralic peoples. Generally speaking, these migrations seem to have been gradual and peaceful, if not even desired for by some of the rulers of the areas, though an exception to this did occur in 1230 when the aforementioned Teutonic Order launched the Prussian Crusade against the original Baltic inhabitants of the land, with the official aim of Christianizing them. Over the course of many decades, the Teutonic Order eventually conquered all of Prussia, and began inviting mostly German, but also Dutch, Polish, and other settlers to the region, establishing cities such as Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, in the process, eventually fully assimilating or displacing the original Baltic Prussian inhabitants, and laying the foundations for what the state would eventually become. I actually have an entire separate video on the Prussian Crusade, so if you want to know more about that, you should check that out. Back in Germany proper though, between 1212 and 1250, King of Germany, Italy, and Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, was busy establishing a modern professionally administered state from his base in Sicily, from which he also resumed a conquest of Italy, leading to further conflict with the papacy, which had become at odds with the empire in the preceding centuries. This war greatly weakened the empire, and unsurprisingly resulted in Frederick being excommunicated by the church 3 times. Following Frederick's death, the Hohenstaufen dynasty fell, leaving the empire in a 23-year interim period from 1250 to 1273 without an emperor, which eventually came to an end when a small Swabian count, Rudolf of Habsburg, yes, the same Habsburgs that would eventually rule Austria and Spain, was elected as emperor. The new dynasty continued its power struggles and conflict with the church, which in 1338 eventually led to the Declaration at Rennes, in which the papacy was stripped of any power in terms of the passing on of royal titles and rule over the empire. The further decree of the Golden Bull in 1356 declared that all future emperors were to be chosen by a college of only 7, 4 secular and 3 clerical electors, with the secular electors being the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the clerical ones the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. This decree came in the aftermath of the Black Death, which had ravaged Europe and Germany in the years preceding from 1347 to 51, in which it is thought that between 30 to 60% of Europe's population was killed. Sadly, the Black Death caused a substantial amount of internal conflict in the empire, with minority groups, particularly Jews, being blamed and attacked, with one of the worst cases of this being the Erfurt massacre, in which somewhere between 100 and 3,000 Jews were massacred, and the survivors expelled from the city, either due to the belief that the Jews were behind the outbreaks by poisoning wells, or the belief that killing the local Jews would prevent the spread of the Black Death to that locale. This, unsurprisingly, doesn't seem to have done the people of Erfurt much good, as the Black Death went on to ravage the city the year after the massacre in 1350. With over 16,000 residents dying during a 10-week period, as a consequence of these attacks against the Jewish people, which it must be said were not exclusive to Germany and occurred across Europe. Many Jews fled and resettled in Eastern Europe. One positive that can be taken from the Black Death is that, like elsewhere in Europe, the disease greatly changed the societal dynamics in the empire, as religious obedience and political loyalties declined, and the rise of the cities and emergence of the new burgher class whittled away at the societal, legal, and economic order of feudalism. Also during this time, the concept of a unified Germany seems to have begun gaining more and more traction, with the term German nation becoming more widely used throughout the 15th century, as well as the addition of Nationis Germanicae, meaning of German nation, to the emperor's titles, also during this period. In the following 16th century, another significant societal change would take place in Germany, when in 1517 the monk Martin Luther published a pamphlet with his 95 theses criticising some of the ways of the old church, going on to post it in the town square of Wittenberg shortly after, also handing copies to some feudal lords in the process. His list detailed 95 assertions in which Martin Luther argued represented the corrupt practice of the Christian faith and misconduct within the Catholic Church. Though it may not have necessarily been his main intention, Luther's ideas went on to garner widespread support in Germany, eventually culminating in the Protestant Reformation in 1521. During this time, the ideas of the Reformation spread rapidly throughout the country, helped by Charles V's wars with France and the Turks, which were unpopular in Germany. It was also during this time that, hiding in Wartburg Castle, Luther translated the Bible into German, which went on to greatly contribute to the establishment of High German or Hochdeutsch, which is today used as the standard form of German, allowing easy communication between speakers of different German dialects. Over the next few decades, religious tensions began to escalate further and further in Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire as a whole, as neighbours and family members even turned against each other in the growing Catholic versus Protestant feud. A significant escalation in this occurred when the Catholic Counter-Reformation was launched in 1545, with the intent to challenge and contain the Protestant Reformation by force if necessary. In 1547, the Emperor himself, Charles V, who remained pro-Catholic, defeated the Schmalkaldic League, a military alliance of Protestant rulers, though Protestant resistance still persisted. A few years later, in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg decreed the official recognition of the Lutheran faith and religious divisions of the empire. Thus, the Counter-Reformation was ultimately a failure, as it had never managed to reintegrate the central and northern German Lutheran states. Unfortunately, these opposing religious factions would not be able to maintain peace for long, and in 1618, the devastating 30 Years' War broke out, spanning much of Central Europe, though tracing its origins almost exclusively back to the Holy Roman Empire. It is believed that one of the main instigations of this conflict was the new Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II's attempts to achieve religious and political unity in the empire, which the Protestant Union, formed in 1608 as a coalition of many German Protestant states, fiercely opposed. The war eventually escalated into a European-wide conflict through the intervention of the Danes, Swedes, and French in 1625, 1630, and 1635 respectively. Over the course of the war, it increasingly became about the struggle between the French House of Bourbon and the House of Habsburg, who by this time solely ruled the Holy Roman Empire for dominance in Europe, in which the central German territories of the empire served as the battleground. The war ranks among the most catastrophic and devastating in the entirety of human history, and honestly deserves a video of its own, so if you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments. The 3 decades of constant warfare which characterized the war led to untold destruction and devastation across much of Germany. Marauding armies incessantly pillaged the countryside, seized and levied heavy taxes on cities, and indiscriminately plundered the food stocks of the lower classes. There were also countless bands of murderous outlaws going around, murdering, raping, and generally causing causing chaos. On top of all this, crop failures and pandemics further crippled the already on their knees population, so to put it simply, it was not a very good time to be a German. Estimates vary as to how many people were ultimately killed in the conflict, though they vary from a population drop of about 38% from 16 million in 1680 to 10 million by 1650 in the Holy Roman Empire, to a 20% drop from 20 to 16 million. The Altmark region, comprising the northern third of Saxony-Anhalt in modern times, and of Württemberg, were especially hard hit, taking generations to fully recover from the carnage. Fortunately, the war was the last major religious struggle in mainland Europe, and finally came to an end in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. The war resulted in increased autonomy for the constituent states of the Holy Roman Empire and a limiting of the power of the emperor. This increased autonomy would prove crucial in the centuries to come, as one soon-to-be very important principality, known as Brandenburg, Prussia, ruled by the I'm sure some of you will recognise Hohenzollern family, began expanding its power and influence. They did this largely through war, gaining East Pomerania in the aforementioned Peace of Westphalia, and even managing to throw off their vassalage under Poland during the Second Northern War from 1655 to 60. In the decades to come, Prussia, under the leadership of King Frederick William I, known as the Soldier King, established the structures for the highly centralized Prussian state and raised a professional army somewhat similar to what Sweden had done during this period, which would prove to be absolutely crucial for their future ambitions. Back down in the southern areas of the Holy Roman Empire, an important shift was occurring, for as following the last-minute relief of Vienna from the imminent capture by a large Turkish force in 1683, the combined troops of the Holy League, which included the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Holy Roman Empire, Venetian Republic, and the Tsardom of Russia, worked together to limit the Ottomans' expansion into Europe, reconquering Hungary in 1687, with what became known as the Great Turkish War coming to an end in 1699 with the Treaty of Karlowitz. War soon broke out in the region once more though, between the Habsburg monarchy and the Ottomans in 1716, when attempting to reconquer their lost lands and viewing the Austrians as a threat, the Ottomans declared war, though they were eventually defeated, and at the Treaty of Passarowitz, the Archduchy of Austria was permitted to freely establish royal dominions in Serbia and Banat to maintain hegemony in southeastern Europe, on which the future Austrian Empire was largely based. Austria would not be the only major state expanding its power though. As mentioned previously, the Prussians over the course of the next century under the leadership of Frederick the Great would almost double their territory throughout the course of many wars, including one between themselves and much of the rest of Germany against Austria and the Habsburg monarchy, as well as the three partitions of Poland during the late 18th century, which were instigated by the Prussians, in which they eventually occupied all the western territories of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while Austria and Russia took the remaining lands, with the effect that Poland ceased to exist as an independent state until following the First World War. This time period in Central Europe was characterized by an ever-intensifying power struggle between Prussia and Austria, who, while both still holding lands within the Holy Roman Empire, also had lands outside it, and seemingly acted practically independently. In Germany itself during this time, and the centuries that followed, many of the smaller German states were unsurprisingly overshadowed by the two giants next to them, with even larger ones such as Bavaria, which had an inferior rural economy, and Saxony, which although in an economically good way, numerous wars had taken their toll upon, ultimately being dominated by either Prussia or Austria as well. On a more peaceful note, during the mid-18th century, the Age of Enlightenment took a solid hold in Germany, resulting in a golden age of art, music, philosophy, science, and literature. Through this process also establishing German as the prevailing language of philosophy, scholarly instruction, and research. Times would not remain peaceful in Europe for long though, as always seems to be the case, as following the French Revolution and the execution of the French king in 1793, Europe would once more become embroiled in countless wars over the next 2 decades as the French attempted to spread their revolutionary ideals. These conflicts only escalated further following the emergence of the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804, with the new French emperor going on to establish control over most of Western Europe, including practically all the German states apart from Prussia and Austria. By this time, the old Holy Roman Empire was little more than a joke, with any shred of centralization it may have once had being long gone, making it exceptionally easy for Napoleon to simply dissolve it altogether in 1806, and form the Confederation of the Rhine in its place, firmly under his control. Napoleon's hegemony over Europe would not last forever though, as following his catastrophically failed invasion of Russia in 1812, Prussia allied with the Russians in the Sixth Coalition, soon joined by Austria and numerous other states, including Britain, launched yet another war against Napoleon. Following the coalition's decisive victory in the Battle of Leipzig in late 1813, the alliance gained another member, with the German states of the Confederation of the Rhine switching sides in return for guarantees of the sovereignty and integrity of the southern German states, being Baden, Württemberg, and Bavaria. Coalition forces went on to invade France in early 1814, and by the April of that same year, Paris had fallen and Napoleon had surrendered. Unsurprisingly, as one of the victors, Prussia gained extensive territory in Germany, strengthening their power even further. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the 39 former states of the Confederation of the Rhine joined the German Confederacy, a loose agreement for mutual defense, with any attempts of economic integration and customs coordination being repressed by anti-national policies. In the coming decades, yet another pivotal change would come to Germany in the form of the Industrial Revolution, which, a bit behind countries such as Britain, France, and Belgium, only took off in Germany after 1850, when the railroads required for industrialization were largely completed. Also during this time, starting around 1840, many Germans began migrating to the New World, with about 6 million Germans ultimately leaving the country in the decades that followed, with the vast majority of these settling in the US, with there now being roughly 41 million people in America alone who have either full or partial German ancestry, representing about 12% of the modern US's population. Back in Europe though, during the mid-19th century, Prussia, not too surprisingly, continued to expand its influence, and similar to the rest of Germany, industrialized appropriately. Throughout large parts of this century, prior to this point as well as after it, Prussia had begun annexing many of the smaller German states, which combined with the only becoming more and more obvious need for a unified German state with a uniform currency, legal system, and government, following the rapid industrialization of the land, laid the foundations for the German Empire to come. The never-ending Prussian ambitions were on full display when, in 1864, tensions between itself and Denmark over Schleswig escalated into full-scale war, which, with the help of Austria, resulted in Prussia easily defeating the smaller Danish kingdom and occupying Jutland, with the Danes being forced to cede both the Duchy of Schleswig and the Duchy of Holstein to Austria and Prussia respectively. It would be the management of these two duchies which led to tensions between the Prussians and Austrians, with the Austrians wishing for them to become an independent entity within the German Confederation, while Prussia simply intended to annex them. This disagreement served as a pretext for the 7 Weeks' War between the two nations, where their two enormous armies clashed at the Battle of Königgrätz, involving 500,000 men. Ultimately, the Prussians' superior logistics, as well as their superior guns, proved to be instrumental, with the Prussians emerging victorious in the battle, which killed nearly 40,000 men, of which only 9,000 were Prussian, with the remaining 31,000 being Austrians. Prussia's victory in this battle and the war proved to be decisive in the struggle for hegemony in Germany, which had lasted all these years, with the Prussians coming out on top once and for all. In spite of their victory, the Prussians were deliberately lenient with the defeated Austrians, who went on to play a secondary role in much of Germany's future affairs. Also following the end of the 7 Weeks' War, the German Confederation was dissolved, with the North German Federation taking its place under the leadership of Prussia. This confederation doesn't seem to have ever been intended to be permanent though, and rather just a transitional organisation between the dissolution of the German Confederation and the ultimate foundation of the German Empire, which finally came on the 18th of January 1871, when, during the siege of Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, William I, King of Prussia, was proclaimed Emperor of all the lands now a part of modern-day Germany, plus a few more. The newly formed empire, which consisted of 25 states, immediately faced divisions within, primarily in terms of culture and economy. For example, many people in the smaller states, especially in central and southern Germany, greatly rejected the Prussianized concept of the nation, and preferred to identify with their own individual home state rather than a unified Germany. The Hanseatic port cities of Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck also proved to be a great challenge for the Prussians, as they all objected to Prussian ideas of economic integration, and refused to sign the renewed Zollverein, or custom union, all the way until 1888. These port cities also fiercely opposed Prussian militarism and its unopposed growing influence in the newly unified Germany. It was these tensions that actually led Otto von Bismarck, who had been named the Chancellor of the new state, to characterize the citizens of Hamburg as extremely irritating, with the German ambassador in London also later saying that they were the worst Germans we have. In the years immediately following unification, Bismarck made efforts to unify the German identity and reduce the influence of Catholicism in favour of Prussian Protestantism, but only with marginal success. Also during this time, the policies of Germanization were continued, leaving the millions of non-German imperial subjects, such as the Polish, Danish, and French minorities, no choice but to either endure discrimination in the new empire or accept the policies. The Poles in particular, being the largest of the minorities and often considered backward Slavs, faced the worst of these policies, and were still treated as an ethnic minority even in the provinces where they made up the majority of the population. The Poles were actually extremely resistant to these policies though, and numerous anti-Polish laws seem to have had little or no effect. Interestingly, in the Polish majority province of Posen, where a series of anti-Polish measures were enforced, the German-speaking population actually dropped from 42.8% in 1871 to 38.1% in 1905 despite all efforts. As for the German majority in the rest of the country, during this time the Prussians implemented many measures in the hopes of creating more unity within the country, eventually achieving some success. A big shift would come to Germany when the first emperor of the unified state, William I, died in 1888, followed by his son Frederick III, who despite being open to a more liberal political course, only reigned for 99 days as he was stricken by throat cancer and died 3 months after his coronation. Frederick in turn was succeeded by his son, Wilhelm II, aged just 29 at the time. Wilhelm, unlike his father, rejected liberal ideas and embarked on a conservative autocratic rule early on, deciding to replace with the political elite and in March 1890 even forcing the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck into retirement. Following his ideas of personal regiment, Wilhelm was determined to exercise maximum influence on all government affairs. Shortly following his ascension to the throne, the now Kaiser Wilhelm II set out to apply his imperialist ideas of Weltpolitik, or world politics, which involved an aggressive political course to increase the empire's influence and control over the world. Following the removal of Bismarck, these foreign policy efforts were managed by both the Kaiser himself directly as well as the Federal Foreign Office under Friedrich von Holstein. The state of these foreign policies were not helped by the erratic and often volatile personality of the Kaiser, who was described by German historian Thomas Nipperdey as gifted with a quick understanding, sometimes brilliant, with a taste for the modern, technology, industry, science, but at the same time superficial, hasty, restless, unable to relax, without any deeper level of seriousness, without any desire for hard work or drive to see things through to the end, without any sense of sobriety, balance or boundaries, or even for reality and real problems, uncontrollable and scarcely capable of learning from experience, desperate for applause and success. As Bismarck said early on in his life, he wanted every day to be his birthday, romantic, sentimental, and theatrical, unsure and arrogant, with an immeasurably exaggerated self-confidence and a desire to show off, a juvenile cadet who never took the tone of the officers' mess out of his voice, and brashly wanted to play the part of the supreme warlord, full of panicky fear of a monotonous life without any diversions and yet aimless, pathological in his hatred against his English mother. It was perhaps partially due to these detailed personality traits that Germany sought after a policy which ever increased tensions within Europe, with the refusal to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia, prompting it to form a closer relationship with France, and the naval arms race with Britain being just two examples of this. His relationship with Britain in particular was especially complex, as he himself was half British through his mother. Historian David Fromkin states that Wilhelm had a love-hate relationship with the British, saying that, from the outset, the half-German side of him was at war with the English side. He was widely jealous of the British, desiring to be British and to be better at being the British than the British were, while at the same time hating them and resenting them, jealous of the British because he could never be fully accepted by them. Regardless of the Kaiser's flaws and role in increasing tensions in Europe, it would not be his hand which would ultimately spark the match that would begin World War I. This rather came from Germany's close ally Austria-Hungary, when following decades of ethnic tensions, Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914, setting off a chain of events known as the July Crisis, which ultimately resulted in Europe being at war with each other, with the Germans, Austro-Hungarians, Ottomans, and later Bulgarians against the Allies, consisting chiefly of Russia, France, Britain, and in 1915, Italy. Due to the nature of the alliances, World War I was split into the Western and the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, the Germans sought a quick victory against the French by encircling Paris under the Schlieffen Plan, which comprised of marching their armies through Belgium rather than attack across the heavily fortified Maginot Line along the French-German border. Unfortunately for the Germans and the Kaiser, this plan was ultimately quashed by fierce Belgian resistance, and before long, the entire Western Front was engulfed in the brutal and bloody trench warfare World War I is known for today. In the east, trench warfare had a less significant role, and the front line was significantly more fluid. Early on in the war in the east, the Germans achieved a significant victory, trapping and defeating large parts of the Russian army at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914. This success was followed by further advancements by the Austrian and German armies, which ultimately resulted in the breakdown of Russian forces, exhausted by internal turmoil caused by the 1917 Russian Revolution, which ultimately led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk signed by the new Bolshevik government, heavily in Germany's favour, on the 3rd of March 1918, marking Russia's official exit from the war. This treaty essentially gave Germany control over Eastern Europe, with the extraordinarily harsh terms apparently even shocking the German negotiator. Regardless of the harshness, the Russians did sign the treaty and withdrew from the war, freeing up hundreds of thousands of combat troops to be sent to the Western Front, which gave Germany a numerical advantage over the Allies. In an attempt to make the most of this advantage before the Americans, who had declared war on the Germans in April 1917, following Germany's declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare, could arrive in mass, the Germans launched a series of campaigns known as the Spring Offensives, though all these eventually failed, and it became clear to many that it was only a matter of time before the German army would be destroyed. It was this, combined with the war-weary population back home, that eventually allowed the democratic parties of Germany to seize complete control over the government in the German Revolution, beginning on the 3rd of November with a sailors' mutiny in Kiel, which spread rapidly and all but bloodlessly across Germany. Within a week, workers' and soldiers' councils were in control of government and military institutions across most of the empire, and on the 9th of November, Germany was officially declared a republic. The armistice, which finally brought about the end of the brutal Great War, came into effect on the 11th of November 1918, organised and signed by the new German government. As for the Kaiser, by the end of November 1918, all of Germany's ruling monarchs, including Emperor Wilhelm II, had been forced to officially abdicate, with Wilhelm then fleeing to the Netherlands, where he lived out the remainder of his life. The rule of the Democrats would be far from stable though, and during its first few years, especially following the Treaty of Versailles, which was very unpopular in Germany due to its strict terms, political violence from those on the right, who wanted a return to the monarchy, and those on the left, who wanted a Soviet-style regime, repeatedly threatened the Democratic Party, with one of the most notable of these events being the rise of the People's State of Bavaria, and later Bavarian Soviet Republic, and their attempts to break free and create a communist state in the country's south, which was only quelled by sheer brute force with high casualties, and was largely thanks to the Freikorps' intervention on the behalf of the ruling government. Once what became known as Weimar Republic made its way through the worst of this political violence, at least for now, things did not remain good for long, as in the early 1930s the country saw a massive economic collapse, thanks both due to the harsh terms imposed by the Allies in the Treaty of Versailles, notably the astonishingly large reparations which crippled the German economy, as well as the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the beginning of the Great Depression, which hit Germany very hard, making the situation even worse for the already struggling nation. It was against this backdrop that the party, which cannot be named lest this video be destroyed by YouTube, became the largest party in the Reichstag, following the election of July 1932, receiving 37% of the vote, followed by the Democrats with 22% of the vote and the Communists with 14%. These parties, all with extremely differing views, unsurprisingly were unable to form a stable coalition, which resulted in the man who also cannot be named being appointed Chancellor before eventually taking full control of Germany on the 23rd of March 1933. This new extremist German government quickly went about expanding the German army and re-establishing the Luftwaffe, before marching into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936 with little opposition from the Allies. After Rhineland, they then went on to largely willingly annex Austria in an event known as the Anschluss, before taking the Sudetenland, followed by the rest of Czechoslovakia and a Memel from Lithuania, all with little opposition up until this point. The final line would eventually be crossed when the Germans invaded Poland, quickly overpowering it with their infamous blitzkrieg tactics, thus beginning World War II. After successfully occupying Poland, an 8-month period known as the Phony War commenced, in which nothing of real note occurred, as both sides prepared for a full-scale war in Europe. This Phony War eventually came to an end when the German armies marched into the Low Countries, after having occupied Denmark and invading Norway a month or so prior. After the expectedly quick fall of the Low Countries, the Germans made their way into France, and far more unexpectedly, quickly crushed the French with their blitzkrieg tactics, using the French belief that the German tanks would not be able to move through the Ardennes forest against them with devastating results. Following the occupation of France, the Germans made countless attempts to garner a peace with the British. However, the determined Winston Churchill rejected them at every turn, as the Germans began Operation Sea Lion in the hopes of being able to invade the UK. Once it became apparent to the Germans that it would be impossible to invade Britain, thanks to the RAF's victory in the Battle of Britain and the Royal Navy's superiority, they began to look elsewhere, and turned their attention on what they viewed as their greatest enemy, both ideologically and racially, being the Soviet Union. Feeling the time was right, and knowing they likely could not wait much longer due to their dwindling oil supplies, the Germans launched a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa. The German army, or Wehrmacht, initially achieved great success, making it all the way to the gates of Moscow, committing countless atrocities as they went. Unfortunately for them, the tide first began to turn against the Germans in December 1941, when they were stopped at Moscow, largely due to dwindling supplies, lack of winter equipment, and exhausted and overextended supply lines. Making matters worse for the Germans was the American entry into the war that same month, following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, and the questionable decision of their leader to declare war on the Americans. The American entry into the war would prove to be disastrous, as they lost North Africa in mid-1943, all the while the situation in the east had decidedly turned in the favour of the Soviets, following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad and the failure of the Germans' Kursk offensive around the same time. By late 1944, the Allies and the Soviets were rapidly advancing, as the Allies gained a foothold on the continent for the first time since the start of the war, with landings at Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 and earlier invasion of Italy. Come the beginning of 1945, the Soviets had completely or partially liberated Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, whilst the Allies moved into Germany from the west following the liberation of France, Belgium, and the partial liberation of the Netherlands in the March of that year. Fatefully, the Soviets would end up beating the Allies in the race to Berlin, where they engaged in a brutal siege which on its own killed at least 400,000 people in just a few weeks. Seeing defeat as imminent, the man who, apologies, still cannot be named, took his own life on the 30th of April 1945, with Germany officially surrendering completely a week or so later on the 8th of May 1945. Following Germany's defeat in the war and the onset of the Cold War, the country was essentially torn between the West and the East, the Allies and the Soviets. At the Potsdam Conference from July to August 1945, Germany was divided into 4 military occupation zones by the Allies and the Soviets, with the Soviets controlling the east, the British the northwest, Americans the south, and the French the southwest. The Allied controlled areas eventually unified in 1949, forming West Germany, while that same year the Soviet zone officially became the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, or German Democratic Republic, more simply known as East Germany, solidifying the two-state system which would dominate the political sphere of the once unified country for decades to come. In the east, the country was quickly turned into a communist utopia, adopting a Soviet-style economy, later becoming the most advanced country in the Eastern Bloc. Despite its comparatively wealthy and prosperous status compared to its other communist counterparts, many East Germans desired to flee the country and ruthless tactics of the Stasi or secret police, and by 1961 some 2.6 million people had fled East Germany, largely via Berlin, which had been split between the East and the West. This outpouring of immigration eventually resulted in the East German and Soviet governments heavily cracking down on such actions, building the Berlin Wall in 1961, effectively splitting the city in two. Over in the West, things went remarkably well for the West Germans following the end of the war, as the newly formed country experienced significant economic growth in the post-war years, with great assistance from the American Marshall Plan. West Germany actually ended up becoming a well-respected and legitimate member of the Western world, and managed to shed its horrible reputation from the World War II era. West Germany went on to play a central role in the creation of European cooperation, joining NATO in 1955 and becoming a founding member of the European Economic Community, which would eventually develop into the EU in 1958. However, despite the country's prosperity, one thing remained incomplete. Following decades of being split in half, during the summer of 1989, rapid changes known as the Peaceful Revolution, or the Die Wende, took place in East Germany, sending East Germany barreling towards reunification with the West. The opening of the Iron Curtain between Austria and Hungary at the Pan-European picnic in August 1989 further triggered a chain reaction, resulting in the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc. During this time, thousands of East Germans continued to try to reach the West, with this exodus generating ever greater demands for political change in the country. Unable to stop this growing unrest, Erich Honecker, the leader of East Germany, was forced to resign in October, with the East German authorities then making the unexpected decision to allow East German citizens to enter West Berlin and West Germany, with hundreds of thousands of people taking advantage of the opportunity to do so. This led to the acceleration of the process of reforms in East Germany, which ultimately culminated in the dissolution of East Germany and the German reunification that came into effect on the 3rd of October 1990. Well guys, I think that's where I'm going to end the video before we get into anything too modern. I am sweating as I am recording this, as it is quite hot in Australia here at the moment, and that certainly was a long video. So if you watched the whole thing, you are an absolute legend, and I'd love it if you let me know in the comments. If you did enjoy this video, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. But with all that being said, as always, I hope you all have a great day, night, wherever you are, and hope to see you all in the next one.